Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm your host, Alexander Eth, and today we are so excited to welcome back to the show esoteric cartographer and contemplative mystic, David Chaim Smith. Now, I know many of you listeners are familiar with David's work. David is both an esoteric cartographer and a contemplative mystic, and his contemplative mysticism is a radical kind because it breaks the emanationistic tendencies that esotericists and practitioners might engage in. And so instead of approaching reality as a series of dependent correspondences, and in esotericism, there's, of course, a lot of discussion about correspondences and correspondence tables or spheres. David's Kabbalistic alchemy is radically non-emanationistic. So definitely check out the previous episodes with Dave because he shares about how his work engages one to bathe in the ground of reality itself. And that theme of non-emanationism was present throughout all of David Chaim Smith's works, including his seminal multi-volume Lightning Flash of Alef series, which started all the way back in 2016. And that series is culminating in his latest tome, the Eneatych. So we're going to be talking about all of that. David Chaim Smith, as always, thank you just so much for stopping on the podcast today.
Thank you, Alex. Well said. Your introduction was really articulate and said it really well. And I kind of want to keep it a little simpler today than we usually put out for people, which tends to be on the complex and wordy side. And I'm going to just try to do broad strokes because I'm summing up a series of books with a content that's really not suitable for a 45-minute or an hour-long conversation, you know? So let's try to just get the general big picture of what's going on, because I am ending the series with this last book, this next book, I should say.
Yes. So Dave, just to follow that, the most logical question is, why are you ending the Lightning Flash of Alef series?
Yeah, that's pretty important to say. It's because the content of this book that's forthcoming by the end of the summer finalizes the ideas that were set out through all the books and sums them up in a cohesive form, in a form that reduces them to the simplest possible explanations, and also gives the main practice that I've been doing for years and the type of contemplative mysticism I'm involved with. and nothing of the kind was done in previous books. It's not that it was planned this way. It's just that the books evolved to the point of a culmination. And once that culmination was given, obviously, I reached the end of a cycle, and it's obvious only when you see what I've put out, when you see the actual book. And it's not that I'm going to stop working, quite the contrary. I'm just changing registers. So I'll be doing different work in a different format. What that will be, I do not know. But everything that I've worked on since the first volume of Lightning Flash of Alef came to a clarity, a kind of crystallization in the last volume, and that work was completed. I basically summarized what I was trying to do in enough of a way that I thought that it was a working set, and now I can move on. It's like switching octaves in music.
So to follow that with this octave, your latest tome of the last tome of the Lightning Flash of Alef series, the Eneatych, why is this specific tome the culmination of the series itself?
Yeah, well, the word, which people are going to have trouble pronouncing, Eneatych, Enea means ninefold. Tick refers to set of consecutive parts, like a triptych or a diptych in painting. So a Eneatych is a ninefold series of parts. And for years, many more years than the Lightning Flash of Alef series was going on, I have been collecting my insights and innovations on the Kabbalistic system primarily, and the alchemical process in relation to it in notebooks. And the type of notebook that I use, certainly for the past 15 years, is highly unorthodox. It's an unbound notebook style. I carry it in my right breast pocket of my shirt. Those of you who know me know that I wear the same clothes all the time, so it's always the same shirt. And these cards, right, are what I write my insights on. The other one are my pens, okay? So what is done with these? Well, I take the best of the notes from the cards that I carry around and constantly do notations on all day throughout the day. And I distill them down to parts that I extract and put in an ongoing document that I refer to as the long scroll. It's long in the sense that it's ongoing. You know, it's the sort of indefinite nature makes it long. And scroll in the sense that I'm playing off of the Kabbalistic context of a rolled Ilanot style diagrammatic analysis. In Kabbalah, very often these sorts of notations are rolled up, like a Torah scroll is rolled up. That's just as opposed to a bound book in the Western sense. That's how information's presented. So the long scroll is the summary of all the innovations and notes that I've done. And I've taken that long scroll format, which sums up all my ideas, and I've distilled it down and distilled it down and distilled it down over and over again, copying over the entire thing multiple times, each time getting more potent and concise. And eventually, and by the way, you can see commentary on long scroll ideas on YouTube and whatnot, but that's the basis and the genesis of what goes into the books and has been since before the Lightning Flash of Alef days. So it reached a culmination when I took this entire body of notations, the long scroll notations, and distilled it down to 9 basic categories. And those 9 basic categories became the Eneatych. So when I summed it up in a very concise way in just a couple of pages for each category and reduced the categories to the 9-fold Eneatych format, I realized that I'd summed up everything I'd been doing to that point, and that mode of inquiry, I wouldn't want to say it's over, but it had reached a conclusion for the way that I was investigating it. So the Eneatych is the summary of these long scroll ideas, which basically summarize the path of contemplative mysticism through my own view of Kabbalah. So it's almost like, from my own perspective, the entire subject of Kabbalistic inquiry can be studied through these 9 categories, and they form a sort of a curriculum. If you're interested in investigating the subject the way that I do it, you could do it through the lens of these 9 windows, you could say.
And before we discuss the division of the Eneatych and the kind of 9 parts that you were just alluding to, Dave, this might be a great opportunity to, speaking of broad strokes, to ask you, what is your concern as a contemplative mystic with formlessness? What is formlessness? With pure essentiality above all of this other concern with spirits and gods and realms and energies and ideas? Can you just kind of parse that out for us?
Yeah. The main concern is essentiality, the essence of reality as a whole, right? That's my only concern, the essence of reality. That includes everything else, right? So when you talk about the means of expression of that essence, you could express it in terms of God forms or theological concepts or alchemical stages or interactions with substance or psychological states or symbols or any of these things. But all of those things, in addition to being means of expression for pure essence, pure essentiality, the mind can also reify them, which means to treat them as an ordinary mental object. And then the whole thing is lost. Because the only way that you could approach essentiality on its own terms is as wholeness. So as soon as you reduce it to an ordinary mental construct, it becomes just another idea. It becomes just another thought in your head, albeit a special one. And then your habits can kick in, and conceptuality can essentially treat it as a grandiose version of what you're already doing. To make the real break with conventionality, one has to enter into wholeness on its own terms, which is not our own terms, not the terms dictated by our habits or our psychological states or our desires or our mythologies or any of our ideologies. Entering into wholeness, from my perspective, is the touch point with the non-dual, with the essence itself, which is generally referred to in religious terms as the divine. So I'm not particularly concerned with gods or angels or demons or monsters or even human beings or realms or times or energies or the planets or any of these things. They can all be used as the means of expression for the ultimate, or they cannot. You could use the same symbol systems to express pure gnosis as you can to express your own human habits, which reduce it to the coarsest possible terms in no time. And those who reduce their mental constructs to their ordinary habits don't know that they're doing that. So you can get all caught up in all kinds of ideas and not make any kind of a break at all with the mode of function that expresses who and what you are. So I start out from the beginning stating very clearly, I'm only interested in the essence of reality, and that's my main concern. Everything else is a secondary concern, which is not to say that I dismiss it, which is not to say that I dismiss the idea of non-corporeal entities or the realms in which they live, the dimensions in which they live. I certainly do not. But it's a means to an end and not an end in itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let me give you this example, Dave. So someone out there might be listening who is familiar with or engages in, for instance, angelic invocations. And they might say, okay, Michael traditionally is the angel of Sunday. It's the day and hour of Sunday. I'm engaging in in a very specific ritual to communicate with Michael and ask for specific information or knowledge, etc. What you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that ritual itself, even from a grimoire perspective, those ritualistic procedures, the concept of Michael, all of those things can be used as an expression of gnosis, but it depends from a contemplative mystic side. It depends on how you use these symbols, how you interpret them, and how you work with them. Is that fair?
Yeah. Those methods that you mentioned are neither good nor bad. My only question for somebody working in that way, or any way, is to what end? To what end do you do this? And what you'll find when you ask people what the goal of their work is that their main concern comes out immediately. You see why they're doing what they're doing on contact when you ask that question. You also find that very often people don't know why they're doing what they're doing. They just got caught up in something and the method becomes preeminent in their mind, and they're working sort of mechanically on something that might have divine overtones. But if the goal of the work is not primary, foremost, in the front of your mind at all times, it's very easy to lose sight of it. So sure, you could invoke an archangel and do all the rituals necessary for the preparation of contact with that archangel. But if it's not in service of one thing, then it will be in service of something else. And the one thing that I'm interested in is essentiality. The thing that it could default to will always be your own conceptual habits, your human views, your human ideas, your human hopes and fears, your likes and dislikes very often as well.
Fascinating. So from, you are an esoteric cartographer, you're a contemplative mystic. You obviously have decades of experience culminating in your Lightning Flash of Alef series. So what you're saying, Dave, is all of these different correspondences and beings and everything else have this potential to be used, as you say, as an expression in your contemplative mystic system as pure gnosis, as the ground. Perhaps you could share with us about, for listeners who might be hearing you for the first time, a little bit about your central focus of all of this, which is the ground of reality. Can you just share how those tie into these concepts and correspondences and spirit registers and everything else?
All right. Well, my view of the ground is that it doesn't step down in the expression of its phenomena. Like if you go back to the primordial origins of most explanations of how reality works, most of them, like you said in your introduction, are emanationistic, meaning that there was a source, and derived from that source was produced light or life force, which becomes the currency of expression and creativity. And from that becomes the grandest and most overarching styles of expression. And it becomes more and more specific, stage by stage, level by level, till you get to physical matter. So you have a series of gradations. If you actually believe that there is a discrete source out there in the ultimate, and it steps down and reduces itself or diminishes itself stage by stage, if you actually believe that that happens mechanically, then by the time you get to physical matter, you've distanced yourself from the proximity to that source. What non-emanationist view does is take away this idea that anything has ever been reduced whatsoever, and the essence is irreducible, cannot be reduced, cannot be diminished, it could be distorted by the perception of it, or the misperception of it, I should say, but it is always complete and whole. And what's even more fantastic than that is that which knows reality and that which is known in reality are equally part of the same wholeness. So there is no division between that which knows, the knowing subject, and that which is known, the objects that we think we know. They are part of the same wholeness, which is like an infinite ocean into which we immerse and lose our habitual identifications, reductive conceptuality, and everything that creates distances between things and borders and boundaries between things. And all of those are literally what is shed in mystical practice. It dissolves on its own accord when you hold a view of non-dual essentiality. And if that's your primary interest, whether you use religious terminology or not, whether you call it God or not, and I'm a little bit iffy on the God language, because you could treat God like an ordinary mental object and reify it into a, creator God mythology that becomes problematic in a bunch of registers, especially when you believe in a book that purports that this God tells you to do stuff, like maybe kill people who don't believe in you, or kill different groups, or enslave people, which our Holy Bible does in spades. That issue aside, we could say that this issue of essentiality, if this is really what we're interested in, then any of our esoteric concerns can be used as a tool to express it. And I have no comment for methods that I don't use. So people who are using, for example, grimoires or invoking archangels and all of that. Yes, I believe it can be used in service of what we call ruach hakodesh, or mystical realization, or gnosis, if you want to use the Greek word for it. But I don't have much to say about those things because I don't do those things.
So to that very point, Dave, given your central focus for years on breaking, this kind of habit field that people have for reification, or, just emanationism in general, can you talk about your culmination of the Lightning Flash of Alef series, the Eneatych, and can you talk about the 3 parts of the Aniotic Tome and how those 3 parts relate to each other and what they're communicating?
Yeah, let's start out with that, and then we could talk about what each of the volumes of the Lightning Flash of Alef series set up in service of getting to that point. Sure. Okay, in Eneatych, like I said, means just set of 9, and the set of 9 parts that form the curriculum of study, or I should say the curriculum of contemplation, for the subject of contemplative mysticism via Kabbalah. These 9 categories are presented with a short description, a symbolic image, and a set of numbered points. There's 2 pages with the numbered points on them, which are successive, meaning you read through them and they describe the fullness of that topic going from one point to the next. The initial paragraph that sums it all up gives you the basic idea, so you know what you're looking for. And what you do is essentially contemplate it by first, before anything else, understanding what it is that you're inquiring about. You get an idea from the introductory paragraph, you look at the symbolic image, and you go through the points that draw out the meaning, that elaborate upon the meaning. And what happens in contemplation, which is a very complex topic, is enumerated in a series of steps. The contemplative process as a mystical process is something that I describe in the book as well. So out of the 3 parts of the book, one part is this curriculum, which gives you a simple, concise way to look at the 9 topics that summarize the field of study. That's the second part of the book. I'll get to the first part of the book in a minute because it'll make more sense after I explain parts 2 and 3. Part 3 is an essay on contemplation, explaining all the parts of the process, the stages that one goes through as you start with the intellect, move into the feeling tones generated generally at first by your emotions, but it quickly leaves the emotional register and goes into this pure feeling of etheric sensation, which is generally expressed as a series of what we could call mental textures. But what happens as you enter into the fields of mental texture from what you're contemplating, which is a really interesting thing, because first you think it, and you have a thought, and then you try to feel the thought. And if you feel the thought, you realize that first comes a reaction, an emotional reaction, a psychological reaction. But then when you actually consider what the subject is that you're contemplating, which is non-duality at all times, everything is about non-duality, then you realize that what I think and what I feel is not the point. So once you realize that it's not about me and my understanding that this is about reality itself, you could leave your own concerns of thoughts and feelings and enter into those feeling tone resonances and lose yourself there. And then something takes over, which is not self-referential. And that generally assumes the mode of expression of a kind of a texture that is not me, the subject, nor is it the object that I'm thinking about or feeling. It's something else entirely. You enter into the dimension of the meaning of the subject on its own terms. So you leave ordinary conceptuality behind and enter into the fields of meaning that are being presented. That's very different than analyzing a subjective reaction or some idea of objectivity that you think you're looking at. And once you enter into meaning as a series of textures, apart from what you think you are and what you think you're doing, which is always wrong as a human being, when you're entering into this subject, you can't think about it. It's literally incomprehensible. So you dive head first, like off a diving board, right? You dive into the subject to lose yourself there. But awareness continues and concern for the subject continues. And these textural psychoetheric fields take over. And they are very specific and they're very communicative. They communicate the meaning of what they actually are. And the deeper you go into that, and this gets into some technical areas beyond what can be described in a podcast, but you discover essentiality on its own terms, because each of these 9 windows opens into the same light, right? Each of these 9 windows are looking at the same subject, the same set of concerns, which is divinity itself. The luminosity of the divine, and ultimately the open fullness of the divine. So the way that you do that, simply to sum it all up, would be losing yourself in contemplative concern for the meanings until the meanings take over and draw you to that place of realization where they're meant to go, where they're designed to go. And we're talking about a subject that is designed to communicate essentiality. That's its purpose. Just like that's my main concern, that's the main concern of the subject, right? So the third part of the book is an essay on this process. Okay, so the first part of the book, so we've already said there's the curriculum, there's an essay on contemplation. The first part of the book is a description of a very special practice that I've been doing in one form or another for many, many years. And this is a practice which is fairly simple and easily described and produces the engine that allows for the effulgence of contemplative fullness to emerge from one's own heart. It allows what we call the shefa, which is the essential effulgence that communicates its nature, that communicates the divine nature, the divine resonance, we could say, the divine luminous fullness can be evoked from one's own heart if you produce a kind of a perpetual motion machine, which is done technically through visualization and sound, allowing, well, what starts as the middle of a human being's chest behind the breastbone, right? But ultimately, the heart of a human being is not isolated to the human body, just like the human mind is not isolated to the human brain. The heart of a human being is the heart of all reality and is unlocalizable. It's not in any set of coordinates in time and space. It's the foundation stone of the temple. It's the pivot point of the axis mundi. It's the center point of the Kabbalistic Tzimtzum. It's literally the heart of the temple, the Holy of Holies, where the emphasis of all the sacrifice of the temple is drawn. And this is discovered through what we think is our own isolated individual heart. But once it's realized, we realize that this very concept of individual separation is an illusion. And that falls away through the degree to which we immerse in our concerns. And at a certain point, the heart of reality is not one point, but the expression of all points and all horizons of all points and all equations of context and placement, that all of it shares a single heart essence, a single centrality, which cannot be located anywhere, but yet is expressed everywhere.
So, Dave, to that very point, what you're presenting here is this culmination. It's this deep and total immersion into meaning, as you say, from a contemplative mystic perspective. How did your previous tomes in the Lightning Flash of Alef series set this up? What are the different facets that each of your tomes, which you launched the Lightning Flash of Alef series about 2016. So, for the last 7 years or so, what were each of these tomes setting up, and how did they set up this culmination in the Eneatych?
Well, it's a really good time to talk about that, and I never really talked about it before, because now you can get the overview, right? While I was working on it, I never spoke about previous volumes or my intention behind those volumes because I couldn't see it. You could only see the valley from the mountaintop, So let's go through them. It's pretty interesting to do that. The first Lightning Flash of Alef book was called Deep Principles of Kabbalistic Alchemy. And that was like a mining operation. It was an excavation of a symbol system that was trying to communicate these concerns that I've been describing, which I've been involved in for now at this point over 30 years. But at the time of writing that book, I wanted to communicate these concerns in a language that didn't really exist. I wanted to use existing languages, Kabbalistic languages, alchemical languages, but I wanted to use them in a new way. So I wanted to construct a way of communicating this that didn't start from scratch, but took existing symbol systems and used them differently than they had been before. So I needed to remake the symbols. I needed to re-envision the symbols and how they would function. And I ended up using things that people already knew about, obviously the Tree of Life and the Worlds and the Tzimtzum and the construction of lights and vessels from technical Kabbalah, as well as alchemical stages and transmutation described in ways that people would find familiar, but to a different end, with a different tone, with a different emphasis, because most of that stuff is operating from that emanationist standpoint, which is really not that different from ordinary conceptuality. And it's really rare that you have esoteric subjects that truly deviate from the way that ordinary conceptuality works and really makes a break from it. Sorry about the microphone there. So the first book, Deep Principles, was a mining excavation, and the great majority of it was excavated in hypnagogic states. Like there's this period in the early morning between like 3 and 5 a.m. where I would either be awakened from sleep or I would be sort of semi-awake in a twilight. And since this is what I do, I live in retreat and this is all I think about. That is what was on my mind. Didn't have to switch to it. And without getting into a whole big description that could be misinterpreted, let's just say that these symbols presented themselves and I had to write them down immediately or draw them out immediately. So I went through this period of almost every night getting a new presentation, which added to the pile. And at the end of this process, I had so many different parts, I wasn't yet entirely sure how they all worked together, but I put them all in the same place and I realized, this is a book. So the first book was just the mining operation itself. It's difficult to read and is sort of at points even unreadable, but it's like the raw data. It's the pile of symbols with the view that I've imbued them with, presented for the first time in a new way. The second Lightning Flash of Alef book was an attempt to describe the contemplative process, but through the lens of the Iyun literature of 13th century Kabbalah, especially this one section which describes a hierarchy through which the mystic passes from the Sefer HaIyun, which is one of the main texts of this style of Kabbalah, 13th century pre-Lurianic Kabbalah, the earliest medieval Kabbalah that there is. And I basically give a commentary on this progression. Now, both my attempt at the description of the contemplative process and my commentary on Sefer HaIyun were adapted much more concisely over time as I considered them and used them. So this volume 2 is sort of the raw data that led me to that. It's the predecessor of the essay that I just put out, where I summed up the contemplative process in a way that I think people can really understand and relate to, hopefully with a lot of technical Kabbalah, though. But it really comes from my use of this Iyun material, which is a contemplative style of Kabbalah that is really obscure, right? Most people only know either Lurianic Kabbalah or the sort of Western esoteric post-Golden Dawn Hermetic Kabbalah from the Renaissance, the sort of post-Christian Hermetic Western esoteric simplified version with a single tree in the register of the four worlds. Most people know that. Certainly your audience would. The third volume of Lightning Flash of Alef was the breakthrough, where I got a comprehensive view of the entire path, and I mapped it out as separate diagrams, 32 separate diagrams, and I referred to them as the 32 keys. It's an overview. It's an overview of the entirety of the path, the ground, the process, the culmination. And I put out that book with a set of instructions as to how to do a rudimentary practice to develop the skills that one would need, as well as separate chapters on each of the 32 diagrams with a little commentary on each. And that was out for a few years until I really thought about it even more and realized, I could say this even better. I could make this even more clear. So I rewrote the entire book, basically every sentence in the book, literally a real rewrite, not just a touch up. And I put it out again as a second edition, same volume 3, same set of 32 diagrams. And that's the 32 Keys second edition. I still call it volume 3, even though it came out years later. So that's the overview. And for the first time, when I put out 32 Keys, the stuff in the first 2 volumes started to snap into place, and I realized what I was actually getting at. Now, that doesn't diminish the first 2 volumes in importance if you want to see how the stuff arose in its raw state, right? Look at the first volume. If you want to see insights in the context for the Iyun material and the first attempt to look at contemplation, look at the second volume. But it's only by the third volume that I actually wrote a book. I don't even think the first 2 volumes are complete books. They're sort of like raw data. The fourth volume was something that I needed to do for years, because starting around 2006, my main concern in this subject has revolved around an obsession that I have with a certain 13th century Kabbalistic text from that Iyun lineage called the Fountain of Wisdom. So the fourth volume is a translation of the Fountain of Wisdom by the only guy who ever put out a translation in English, Dr. Mark Verman, and he wrote a special corrected translation for my book, which is better than the one that he put out in his own book, which was in the 80s. No one else ever translated it into English in its complete form other than Verman. So I got in touch with him, got him to concede to spiff up certain parts that we had agreed one could look deeper into. And I put it out as well as my own commentary on it. And that's volume 4. Volume 5 of the Lightning Flash of Alef series is a very odd book indeed, very much like the Eneatych, composed of 3 different parts. The first part analyzes this metaphor for conceptual constructs and their use in the guise of a golem. And golems are seen in this mythological context because of this history that they have in folklore of being sort of animated monsters, like proto-Frankenstein monsters that go out and do the bidding of the magician to terrorize the town and, go get the ignorant villagers with the torches and the pitchforks and whatnot. Made out of mud. All of this is a metaphor, of course, because a golem is just a mental construct that is imbued with life force. It's a charged mental construct. Any magician will know what I'm talking about here. You make a mental construct, you pour tremendous amounts of life force with intentionality mixed together into it. It comes to life. It's the basis of the whole thing of talismanic magic when you're making magical objects. So if one were to do this in a systematic way, with the elements that comprise a mental constructs, which are the elements that comprise reality itself, one has an awesome tool there to do whatever one wants to with it. So that's part of the 5th volume, which is called Quintessence of Secret Mercury. The title, Quintessence of Secret Mercury, comes from a retreat text that I did 3 years of silent, solitary retreat of different types. And during that period of my retreat period, I made these wild notations that it wasn't like writing a book or anything. It was just things that I wrote down involving symbols and my own work and my own inquiry. Eventually, what I did is I collected all that stuff and edited it and put it together in one place, and it became a text. The subsection of Quintessence of Secret Mercury that bears that title is the last chapter of the book, and it's all my retreat materials. And what's interesting about it is it's kind of like the Rosetta Stone for everything else that came later. This is before Lightning Flash of Alef and all that, but all of those symbols are there. And when I looked at it again after years, when I was putting together Lightning Flash of Alef, I couldn't believe it. It's like everything was there that I needed in its embryonic state, right? So if you're interested in this material, it's very interesting to look at that text. It also has a kind of a weird twilight poetry, a psychoetheric poetry that's beautiful in its own right, I believe. The other part of that volume, that 5th volume, is a Mutus Liber style text. Now, there's an alchemical text called the Mutus Liber, but it's actually a category of wordless book. It's a book comprised of images, right? And I did a 16-image cycle, a 16-image Mutus Liber cycle that I later added captions to, but the bulk of it was done as a wordless book. And it describes the mystical process, the mystico-alchemical process. And that's volume 5. Volume 6, Lightning Flash of Alef, volume 6, is a very kind of dark and mysterious book called Black Ether. And Black Ether is a presentation of a single metaphor that spins out into all these different correspondences. But the central metaphor of that book is that of animal sacrifice, which is a greatly misunderstood topic because all of the Judeo-Christian tradition is based on animal sacrifice. The sacrifice is done at the Holy Temple of the Jews in ancient times, which was destroyed twice, once by the Babylonians, once by the Romans. And after the destruction of the Second Temple, you have no more temple. You have no more ability to do the animal sacrifices that were commanded in the Torah. So what do you do? What did the Jews do? Well, they put together a system of prayers and intentions and ways to study that became Rabbinic Judaism, which is the form of Judaism we know today. That's where it comes from. The only reason we have Rabbinic Judaism is because we can't do animal sacrifices, which is what the so-called creator God said he wanted: blood and guts smoking, so that the smoke would rise into the sky and dissipate. And essentially, the creator God entity could eat it, which is to eat the life force that went into it, mixed with the intentionality of its offering. Does that sound suspiciously like a regional protector entity that wanted to feed off of the life force of beings when they had been decimated in the fire? Yes, suspiciously so, in my opinion. That's another topic for another time. What was the God of the ancient Israelites? That's a very interesting topic to look into. Either way, since Christianity comes from Judaism and Judaism comes from animal sacrifice is a pretty potent metaphor. And certainly mystically, sacrificing one's life force, pouring out one's life force in divine inquiry is a very viable model. But when you think about it, you realize that this beast, the sacrificial beast that is laying on the smoking, fiery altar, is itself divine, because everything is. If we hold a non-dual, non-emanationistic view, you can't say that this particular substance is or is not part of the wholeness. It's all part of the wholeness. So what's very interesting about the animal sacrifice at that point as a metaphor is the flesh of the beast is divine. The open expanse into which the smoke of its decimated carcass is released is divine. So the metaphor of animal sacrifice is the divine sacrificing itself to itself through itself. And what a great metaphor to apply to the human mind and one's own intentions. We have egocentric, reductionistic, ordinary conceptuality. That's the beast. The flesh of our own psychophysical organism is what we offer. We pour the whole thing into the fire of our own work, laying ourselves at the altar of sacrifice, which is our own practice, to release into the expanse of infinity, which is not other than what we are offering. So the flesh of the beast sacrifices itself to a God that it already is. And that's the main metaphor of black ether, because what happens when that sacrifice goes deep, 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 deep is you realize that all the reductions, all the skins of reduction can dissolve on contact. So the whole book is about that process, using some fairly dark language. So it's called Black Ether accordingly. That's volume 6. Volume 7 is the Eneatych, where I give the central practice, the curriculum, and an essay explaining how to use it. And that's a set.
So, Dave, this might be a good time, especially as you were just describing Black Ether and this kind of metaphor of sacrifice and pouring and offering life force and whatnot. Someone might be listening and saying, is Dave a pantheist? Panentheism? Can we maybe get into some of these terms? Because you are a non-emanationistic, contemplative mystic, esoteric cartographer is obviously one of many different titles that I can absolutely think of to describe your day-to-day work. So in esotericism, there's all kinds of things. There's panentheism, pantheism, different aspects of approaching reality. Can you define these terms and then share why your work is obviously very different from these terms?
Excellent question. Well, my view is exactly the same as pantheism once you take the theism out. So what would happen if you were to say that everything is God? God would at that point be a wholeness that you could hold as a view and reify. In other words, you would create a monistic view of your divinity. If you do that, that monad is subject to the same kind of reification that you would impute upon any subpart or subset of the whole. In other words, the same way that you could reify a single thought or a single feeling, you would just do with everything. So monism doesn't really get rid of reification. What monism does is an improvement because it allows you to view all phenomena singularly. But then what you do with the singularity can be a subtle form of concretization. So that is a stage in what I'm talking about, because it improves over this fragmented, chaotic habit field. We find ourselves asleep in a sort of a coma in the habit field where individual objects and moments and ways of knowing are like chaotic fragments with no cohesive order. That's kind of the habit field that we're born into, right? It's not by virtue of our own choosing. That's how the realm works. It's a huge improvement to say, as the New Agers claim, everything is one. But everything is one doesn't really work in mysticism, because you could do the same thing with the one that you're doing with everything else. So our release from the one is this idea that you can't reify it, that it's open. It's inherently open. It's inherently without substance, without dimension, without time, without concept, and beyond the dichotomy of being or non-being. It neither is nor is not. And that's very, very interesting, because the monad purports to be a comprehensive, unified, overarching state of beingness. What I'm saying is the essence of reality is beyond all dualistic dichotomy. So you can't say that it is, and you can't say that it is not. If you assume the monad within yourself, you essentially say what the creator God told Moses at the burning bush: I am, right? Ehya, Asher, Ehya, I am, therefore I am, or I will be, therefore I will be, which is projection into the future of the same beingness. So what I'm saying is to get beyond that final barrier of being and non-being, or negative and positive ideation. One releases from the monad, right? And that's very, very interesting, because then your pantheism is not theism anymore, right? So you're still pan,
right?
But the theism part is dissolved at that point. Panentheism is what people think is implied with the Kabbalistic Tzimtzum. It's the idea that there is this dichotomy between immanence and transcendence, but that dichotomy exists secretly within the transcendent, right? It's the idea that within this open wholeness, this incomprehensibility of God, is the capacity for infinite subsets, which are still part of God, but seem to be separate. That creates problems as well. Because if you really, truly believe that there's a difference between the immanent and the transcendent, which is what's implied in panentheism, in certain forms of it anyway, then you're back to your dualism again, right? So what I say to the pantheists is question the monad. What I say to the panentheists is question your immanence and transcendence. Now, both of those forms offer metaphors that can be used for the view that I'm talking about. And one of the main ones that I use is the Tzimtzum. But I don't believe that there's any essential difference between the immanent and the transcendent whatsoever. And it's that very faith in that which transcends that dichotomy, that allows me to use that symbol in a way that is very different from the usual one? Good question.
So if you have somebody listening right now who says, oh yeah, I'm a definite subscriber to what Dave is talking about, and I, approach things in a hermetic way where I believe that, the way I read the texts and the way I do my rituals or magic, that there is this, uncreated one monad, this kind of hermetic, infinite, uncreated light. What you're saying is, okay, from a contemplative mystic perspective, that's a step in the right direction. But because you have this monad, this kind of, I think that all things are one, and there is this uncreated kind of divine light, to use a metaphor, you're saying, but the fact that you even have the monad, there's a risk of reification, of turning it into a simple mental construct. And you're saying that in and of itself, because you're not going deeper past the monad, that in and of itself is a barrier to actual realization of reality, a contemplative mystic immersion in meaning.
Yeah, there is gross level reification. That is me as a separate subject knowing some mental construct as an object. That's gross level reification. But when you're talking about reifying the monad, you're talking about a very subtle level of reification that is so subtle that one wouldn't know it if they were doing it unless they questioned it and were told about questioning it repeated times and saw metaphors that expressed the questioning of it, like we see in various mystical traditions that do this. One such mystical tradition is the form of Kabbalah that exists within certain Hasidic lineages, particularly the work of Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, right? When you look at the Breslover literature, there's a constant questioning of the monad, right? And remember, Judaism states its intentions with the prayer called the Shema, which states divine unity, right? Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Echad means unity, right? But what are you doing with the unity? What unity are you talking about? Is it the unity of a conceptual unity? Is it the unity of a philosophically realized monad or a mystically realized monad? And what does that even mean? Are you grasping at the one as identity and ideation, or are you releasing in that one in the register of something utterly and totally incomprehensible and ungraspable, an irreducible expanse of fullness that cannot be characterized by the human mind? It utterly annihilates the human mind. So all of these languages, just like we were saying before about magical operations, in and of themselves, these are just methods which are neither good nor bad. It's what you do with them and why that defines them. And that's the conversation that we can be having about this work, is why are you doing what you're doing? And then secondarily, we look at the methods and learn to use them as well as we can. But the methods are not the problem. The view behind the methods can very often be the problem.
And that's challenging the view. And that's why that the Eneatych is, as you say, this culmination of the Lightning Flash of Alef series. I think, Dave, this might be a good time to talk about, there's a term, and you're always employing, as you mentioned, these just fascinating terms and sharing, their meaning. What is the aspaclaria? There's this term, aspaclaria, that you employ. Can you just share with the listeners some of the broad strokes and how aspaclaria relates to this greater work, this immersion in meaning?
The aspaclaria is just simply the idea that the realization of the infinite could be expressed through the finite, right? When the infinite is presented to people, they think of formlessness and abstraction, something where one leaves the world of things and goes into nowhere. And that's not exactly true, because the whole of everything, infinite variation, is the lens, is the prism through which divinity itself shines. The light, the prism, the infinite reflections, the pouring out of vitality and color and sound and feeling and thought, the whole of it, all of it, is of one piece, is the essence itself. So it's the outpouring of the infinite in finite form that's actually important. We're not dismissing the finite at all in favor of the infinite, because that would be dualistic, right? To choose non-duality over duality is itself dualistic, right? So the aspaclaria is the use of infinite phenomena as the prism through which the infinite can shine. The term that alludes to this in Western alchemy is the philosopher's stone, the crystallization of the philosopher's stone. It's the culmination of the process of one's work, which crystallizes in the heart of reality, which is the heart of a human being, the heart of the temple, the heart of the universe, right? The pivot point of the axis mundi, right? When that crystallizes in the view to stabilize the realization, the philosopher's stone becomes complete. The aspaclaria. There's two opinions in Talmudic thought as to what the aspaclaria represents. One opinion is that it's a mirror, right? And the other opinion is that it's a lens. It's actually both. It's a mirror-like lens. It is a prism through which any reflection can be reflected. So when you say it's like the mirror has no image of its own, but can reflect any image, right? So that's reality. You get the reality that you form by virtue of your habits. The mirror is you. The mirror is your mind, right? But it's also a prism through which phenomena is engaged. It's the lens through which the vision of reality is seen, we could say. So it's both the mirror and the lens, right? I use prism, but lens is the one that people tend to use. And these are just metaphors. It's the aspaclaria is the way reality is seen by virtue of gnosis, right? It's the goal of the work. And in Kabbalah, and I'll give you a little bit of technical Kabbalah here. Those who follow it will follow it. Those who won't, won't. When you have your single model of the tree, the Sefer Yetzirah says there are 10 sfirot, not 9 and not 11. Well, what's the 11th? The 11th is the quasi-sphera of dot. Dot is human conceptuality. It literally translates to the word knowledge, meaning the fitting together of bits of information, right? That knowledge, the conceptual knowledge that we assemble about our work and our world and our reality, that's what we have to offer. That's part of the flesh of the beast that we put on the altar, right? When we offer it up, both the knower and that which is known, the knowledge and the knower of the knowledge, are consumed in the work, and dot is surrendered to Keter. What that does is it takes the entire middle pillar of the tree and moves it up a notch so that dot isn't there anymore. And in the place where it used to be, Tiferet now occupies. Tiferet literally means beauty, right? So we have this connection between the beauty of Tiferet and the absolute window into the incomprehensible that is Keter, right? Where the view is actually sealed. And all that's involved is the surrender of our conceptuality, the surrender of our knowledge, the sum total of our conceptual knowledge. And that's very much what we're talking about here. And everything in the tree changes after that, after the middle pillar moves up a notch. But really what it comes down to is that original question: why are you doing what you're doing? For what reason? Are you communicating with these spirits because you're interested in the spirits? Because you want something from them? Because you are curious or titillated by it, or possibly vitalized by it? You feel surges of power, or you just think it's real cool? Why get involved in the life of the spirits and the invisible entities? I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying question why. In service of what?
Yeah, that deep questioning is so critical, because I know it's been a theme on the podcast. You and I have talked about this. Other guests have. You have to have a why. You have to have a reason. And just with curiosity, it can lead you down a path of simply satisfying, an experience versus actual deep engagement and results. So I think that's very key.
Well, the thing is that if you don't have the why pretty well worked out, what happens? You go to the default setting. And what's the default setting for the human mind? Well, it's egocentric concerns.
Right. Habit fields.
Yeah. We know very well where the mind goes when it's unguarded, when it goes back to its base state that it started out with. It's maximizing its own pleasure, getting away from the potential for pain. It's moving towards what I like and away from what I don't like. That's what the mind's going to do. Unless it is profoundly interfered with.
Unless it is sacrificed on the immolating altar itself of conceptuality.
Well, that's a form of profound interference, because what you're doing is you're interfering with the mechanism of its base habits.
Mm-hmm.
You're changing its programming. You're rewriting its code, you could say.
So, Dave, given all of this, I know that, there's a note that I had here for our conversation, and it is that the VFT is samsara. Can you describe, just for listeners, what is VFT and what is samsara? I mean, many listeners are familiar with, for instance, Buddhist terminology, but can you just share the broad strokes?
Okay, this gets into some comedy. See, the VFT is a term that I use referring to an eminent philosopher and theorist from the late 20th century, Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was the survivor of a concentration camp, and due to his inquiry in the camp, undergoing profound suffering, wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. Man's Search for Meaning postulated that the Freudian model of pleasure was not, hey, there you go, was not the single driving force behind human endeavors, but actually the ultimate goal of human endeavors was to search for meaningful purposefulness to one's existence, as opposed to pleasurizing one's experience. Now, once you're entering into a search for meaning and the fullness of that meaning, which is not just the meaning of individual things and experiences and conclusions, but meaning itself, the fullness of that meaning, which is imbued in everything. Once you live a life like that, you lead a very different kind of life from an ordinary person. Because an ordinary person is only solely interested in self-pleasurizing. And you could say that for most people, the only shot that the ordinary person generally has on a mass level for meaning is one's own family, the love of one's own family, which is a fine thing. I'm not knocking that, but I'm saying that living for meaning in the larger sense ultimately becomes the mystical quest. So the term VFT that I use, sort of joking around, it stands for Viktor Frankl's toilet. Because what is that toilet? You just put on the internet, right? You just put on the normal discourse of what people are concerned with in the culture, and you get the opposite of the quest for meaning. You get the detritus, the shit of the process that is not, it's geared towards the exact opposite of what Viktor Frankl was talking about. So Viktor Frankl's toilet is the world in its basest, most perverse state. It's the perversity of mass culture.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. And the reason I say that it's like the Buddhist concept of samsara, because the dimension of samsara is generally just the product of chasing what one wants and running away from what doesn't want, and the mad, chaotic fragmentation of chasing after objects that even when we acquire them, we realize that they're not what we thought that they were. When you try to make yourself happy by acquiring what you want or desire or are attracted to, it's pretty obvious that what you thought you wanted and was going to make you happy can't actually fulfill that function. It can't actually make you happy because, like Viktor Frankl pointed out, it's not in acquiring the objects of our desire that we get happy. It's the search for meaning that actually completes us and makes our life purposeful and valuable and profound. Otherwise, we're just chasing after bits, and the bits don't do anything about our actual condition. The actual brokenness of our own condition that makes us suffer cannot be alleviated by the acquisition of anything.
I think I understand, Dave, what you're getting at. It's a very profound point because, like you, I greatly enjoy Viktor Frankl's work, Man's Search for Meaning, and I see what you're saying, that there are some philosophers who say that the thing that should be pursued over all else is pleasure. Other philosophers say, no, it's not pleasure, it's power. And Frankl comes in and says, no, it's not power or pleasure, it's a search for meaning. But what you're saying is, if someone reads Frankl's book and says, yes, I followed all of that, I have meaningful relationships and walks through a forest and meaningful, cups of coffee. What you're saying is, every single thing that could be considered an ordinary source of meaning, there's a big risk from the contemplative mystical side, because there's a risk of taking all of those things and simply reifying them and effectively fetishizing normal situations of meaning as simple mental constructs only. And by doing that, even though you think that, yes, this is very meaningful, and we all have excellent, memories and little moments of meaning, you're saying one must go beyond that to the source, the heart of meaning itself, and offer up in a sacrificial way, if you will, in the blaze of the work itself of a contemplative mystic, all of these conceptions of what could be considered meaningful. Is that somewhat hitting the target?
I'm actually not giving the answer. I'm actually asking the question of what is meaning in the ultimate sense, because to provide any cohesive answer would be missing the mark entirely. The ultimate meaning is incomprehensible. You can't form a concept about it and have it still be viable. That any concept that you have about ultimately meaning is a falling away from the fullness of that which is inherently open. It's pure potentiality. It's pure potency. It's the capacity, like the mirror, to reflect anything, but it has no image of its own. So you can't reduce it to any kind of terms that the mind can grasp. It's irreducible. So ultimate meaning has to be approached only as a question. And all of the terms that we use to address that mystery, terms like Ein Sof, or the divine, or like the theists would say, God, all of those terms are all well and good, but they're a means to an end. They're a means to express something that is literally incomprehensible. And you could use the symbols to get there if you have the view to get there. But you could also use those same very symbols to collapse in reductionism and think that you're talking about something. which is the primary mistake of conceptuality, is the idea that meaning can be reduced to a thing or an idea or a logistical coordinate or a feeling. It doesn't matter what the thing is. If you could reduce it at all, it's not what we're talking about.
So then, okay, given that, Dave, and given your, literal years of work in this specific area and asking that question, can you share with us a little bit about what are some of your main concerns with this style of work as a contemplative mystic? What are the things that really are concerning or that guide you in this process?
Well, they have to do with facing the field of reality as it's presented head on directly, and the idea of directing attention towards the ultimate meaning, wearing the garment of whatever arises on its own terms, holding this view that I've been talking about as reality arises, and realizing that this very display, the malkut of this tree, is Ein Sof in action, right? It's essentially the idea of realizing that there is no difference on an essential level between malkut and keter. When malkut and keter are realized as essentially the same, that sameness is the proof of Ein Sof, the expression of Ein Sof in purest form. There is no Ein Sof apart from reality, and there is no reality apart from Ein Sof. So this essentiality that we're interested in, this ultimate meaning, is not elsewhere. It's right here. It's in the things that we like and want, the things that we don't like and don't want. It's in the prison and the stockyard and the rotting carcass of the dog and the pleasure palace and the beautiful forest, and in all the spirits that populate every realm of presentation, full, teeming with life, right? And in every variation and nuance of sight and color and sound, the wholeness of all of it is the means of expression of ultimate meaning, which is not exactly what Frankl was talking about, but it's through his direction. But in a sense, what Frankl was doing is opening the door for something that even he couldn't address in his book, right? It's sort of like, in AA terms, it would be the 13th step, right? It's the step into steplessness, right? Where it's no longer a humanistic concern anymore, because humanistic concerns are sort of left in the dust after that point. And mysticism can't be reduced to them anymore. So yeah, go ahead.
Dave, to that point, when people are looking at the Eneatych, your last culminating volume of Lightning Flash of Alef series, are there any, I don't want to say, it sounds trite to say pieces of advice for readers as they go through your book, but what should they be expecting? Should they go in chronological order? Does your book give a kind of step-by-step system that someone can actually put into practice? Do they need all of the other volumes of Lightning Flash?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
No. Every book in the Lightning Flash of Alef series is a standalone book. However, if you want to understand how the system was constructed, if you want to understand how these standalone books came into being, you could get all the volumes and follow the development from the first one that mined the symbols to the overview of the 32 keys. 32 keys is a good training system to establish what the path is about and the basic skills of contemplation. It's a very useful book, but you don't need it to do the practice. If you want to know the truth, I think the Eneatych is the most important of all the books, because it gives a basic practice that one could read and learn and then go do. And it's a lifetime practice. It's a practice to do every day of your life for the rest of your life. It's pretty simple. Based on that, one could become a contemplative style of practitioner. Contemplation is described in that essay I told you about. And then I'm giving you a curriculum to contemplate, to apply it to. right? So in a sense, everything that you need to do what I've been doing for a very long time is alluded to in that book. I don't want to say it's summed up comprehensively, but it's the closest I've ever come to summarizing a life of dedication to this path. Now, the other thing that I should say is when anybody will get this book, I have made a determination years ago. I do not get involved with anybody's personal practice or study. So if you write me an email and say, I've had this experience, or what do I do to get over this blockage, or how do I employ this material, I'm not going to be able to help you. All I can do is put out the books and give this tool, and then you make of it whatever you want to make of it. I'm not starting a lineage here. I'm not setting myself up as a teacher. What I do is I put out, for lack of a better term, my data, the evidence of what I've done in my work. And I put it out there, and that is my main practice. In addition to the practices that I do for my personal practice, an aspect of my main practice is putting out the information for others. But the follow-up is on the end of those who receive it. If you want to follow up with this, it's pretty well described how to do the practice, and the curriculum is pretty self-evident. So people could, if they wanted to, make this their path through this book. I don't think any of the other Lightning Flash of Alef books can do that. Or none of the other books I've ever done, because I've done more than Lightning Flash of Alef. I did 5 books before that. None of them set up a way of working that can sustain an actual practice, other than the possible exception of the 32 keys, which is an overview and a training system. And that's a very, very good way to get started, internalizing that overview. One could say that the Eneatych is the follow-up to that, but I don't think it's necessary that you do the 32 keys first.
Dave, I know I join the listeners in just thanking you for taking the time. And as we just wrap up the main part of the podcast, obviously, please, listeners, check out the podcast and video descriptions below to order your copy of Dave's latest and culminating and final tome in the Lightning Flash of Alef series, the Eneatych. Dave, is there anything else as we just wrap up this main part of the podcast that you'd like to leave listeners with?
I would say that concern with the essence of reality, concern with the essence of all things, is not something that somebody develops by virtue of happenstance. I think people who are interested in this are born this way. I think they're wired this way. I think people who are really going to make practitioners have sort of always been like this on some level. Maybe they found a way to express it, maybe they haven't. And it's a very weird way to be. It's very different than ordinary people in an ordinary society. So what I'm doing is I'm putting the call out to the oddballs, the outcasts, the eccentrics, the weirdos who have found throughout their lives that they're a bit different and their concerns are not the usual ones. They're just simply not satisfied being concerned with maximizing their own life. That there's got to be something else. God damn it, there's got to be something else. And if you're one of those people, those restless, weird, half-crazed people out there searching for something because you're just wired that way. You were born that way, right? If I'm talking to you, outcast, oddball, eccentric, outsider, there's something that I could direct you towards. I'm not saying it's the best or the ultimate one. There's plenty of versions of it, but here's one, and I'm talking to you, and you know who you are. For all other parties, you will be disinterested. You will not give a shit about what I have to say. And that includes like 99.9% of the people on the planet will not care about any of these things that I have to say. And I'm not trying to win you over or convince you or sway you. I'm not trying to convince you to drop whatever you're doing to do what I'm doing. I don't care.
David Chaim Smith is an esoteric cartographer, a relentless contemplative mystic, and the Eneatych is the final 7th volume, the climax of his Lightning Flash of Alef series. David, thank you, as always, just for taking some time and sharing your wisdom and your research on the podcast today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex.